find it helpful, please turn in it to Acts chapter 27. This is where we'll spend our time today. One of the frustrations, maybe it's not a frustration, the Bible does a lot of things in our lives. One of them is it's an encouragement. You get to read it and see how God moved in all of these people's lives in the past. But one of the aspects of it, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. We need that. Another aspect of it, though, is, and I don't know how to make this work for anybody. I don't even know how to quantify it for myself, much less somebody else. But it's the fact that, take the book of Acts, where we are right now. We look at it and we say, wow, look at all the stuff that God's doing. I wonder why God doesn't do things like that today, routinely, that we could see. First of all, just to encourage anybody who thinks that way, you've got to realize, I think it's important for us to realize, Acts, from the time of Pentecost till the time Paul winds up in Rome, is about 30 years. This isn't just a week. This is a long time, 30 years. And so if you go through and you say, let's just take all the miracles that God did over that 30-year period, they're not that many. They really aren't. So that's an encouragement to me in the fact that if in a lifetime I see 3 miracles in my life, that's not far away from what was going on in the book of Acts. That means something. It's kind of like, from the standpoint of what God would say to us about the world, if the world were a place where every time we opened our mouth and said, God, would you do X? He did X. This wouldn't be the kind of universe we're used to living in. Things would be just happening, and nobody could depend upon the next minute of the day, because there'd just be stuff happening all around that would make life kind of a willy-nilly situation. But there's another aspect to it as we read the Bible, and that is the fact that it forces us to compare ourselves in the sense of every day we get up, we kind of do the same things, we think the same things, we watch, eat the same things, we do pretty much day by day by day a kind of a routine thing. And after a while, that starts to grind away, and it starts to beat out of us the idea that God is actually doing anything at all. It does. With that in mind, let's look at this text. I'll begin reading in verse 21 of chapter 27. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up and said, you guys should have taken my advice and not have sailed away from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and this loss. Now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God, the God whom I serve, came to me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you all of the lives of all of the sailors who are with you. So keep up your courage, men. I have faith in God that it will happen just as He has told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. The 14th night we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. When about midnight the sailors sensed we were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found that the water was 120 feet deep, or 20 fathoms. Short time later they took another sounding and found it to be about 90 feet deep, or 15 fathoms. Fearing that we would be dashed up on rocks, they dropped some anchors from the stern and prayed for the daylight to come. In an attempt to escape the ship, some of the sailors put the dinghy, were going to go up and get into the dinghy and let it down into the sea. They went up there pretending that they were going to let out some more anchors from the bow. But Paul said to the centurion and to all of the soldiers, if these people do this, unless everyone stays in the boat, none of us will be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes away and let the dinghy go back down into the ocean and fall away from the boat. Just before dawn, Paul urged them to eat. He said, the last 14 days you've been constantly in suspense with no food. Now you haven't eaten at all. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And after he said this, he took some bread and he broke it and thanked God for it in front of them all. And then they all began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. And after altogether there were 276 people on board, counting Paul. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So what we're doing here is we're talking about a large corn vessel from Alexandria, from Egypt. Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome. That's where just like we're the breadbasket for the world. We grow grain and we send it all over the world. Rice, corn, wheat. We feed millions of people besides ourselves. And Alexandria, Egypt, was that for them, because Egypt, their whole society is right next to the Nile River, so they had water for crops year-round, and so they weren't dependent upon rain, so they grew crops year-round. And this is one of the boats that would take all that grain and bring it into the Roman Empire to feed the Roman Empire. It's about 150 feet long, maybe 30 feet wide, and it takes about 30 feet of water. It's a pretty big boat. Paul stands up in the boat and says, I told you guys we shouldn't have come out here. I told you this was going to happen. He encourages them, though. Now, they've done everything they know to do. They've wrapped the ship with ropes. They've thrown over the gear. They're going to throw over all of the grain. The dinghy's been cut away. There's nothing else they can do. This is one of those big square sail boats, and whatever the wind does, the boat does. Well, at this point in the history of their trip, they're just going in a big circle, round and around and around as the wind blows in a circle. They don't have a clue where they are. They don't know anything. It's cloudy. It's dark at night. There are no stars. They don't know where they are. They don't know where they're headed. Then a couple of them say, I know what we'll do. We'll take the dinghy and we'll cut it away and we'll get in it and we'll float off and be saved. And Paul said, this is just mind-boggling to me. Paul's a prisoner. He's not anybody. He's a prisoner on this boat. And he tells them, if you let these guys get in this boat and cut the dinghy away, then none of us will be saved. If you want us all to be saved, they've got to stay here on the boat. And what I find incredible is they listen to him. I mean, can you imagine if today we had 30 guys in orange jumpsuits on the side of the road, and they come up to the guy that's got the shotgun and tell him what they need to do? Do you think he's going to pay any attention to them? I don't think so. And yet, somehow, these people are listening to Paul. Makes you wonder who's in charge of this whole trip. Seems like Paul's pretty well in charge. So they drift for 14 days. They don't eat. And Paul says, the text says, Luke says, that they were so nervous about their situation that they'd not taken any food. And I would be nervous too. If I was out in the middle of the ocean in the dark, I don't have a clue where I am. I'm being blown round and around and around. Nobody's coming. There's no Coast Guard. Nobody's coming out there with a helicopter to come get us. 276 people get lost at sea. That'd just be a blip on the radar screen in the Roman Empire. Nobody would think anything about it. They look to Paul for all of these decisions. How is it that Paul has this? Now, in this situation, you're looking at so many factors. We talked about this just a little last week. We make choices, they've made choices, we're making choices, they're making choices, people all over the world are making choices, and all of those choices play into what's happening on the earth. But then there's another person making choices, and that's God Himself. How do His choices play into all of this? There's a clue about the universe in this. I don't know if you've ever thought about this. One of the arguments, and I deal with this argument in correspondence quite a bit, that people make today, they say, how can you believe in God? Look at the universe. Now, they're right about this when they talk about it this way. They say, look at the size of the universe. Have you ever thought yourself about just how big the universe is? Let me just give you a perspective on how big it is. And then this won't make any sense. I mean, I can't wrap my mind around it either. If you take a pointer and point in any direction around the globe, and off any point away from our globe, 13.72 billion light years in any direction is the universe. Now, a light year is 6 trillion miles. That's how far light travels in a year. I don't even know how far 6 trillion miles is. And there's 13.72 of those in every direction. 20 years ago, this is amazing. 20 years ago, they took the Hubble. Everybody knows what the Hubble telescope is, right? It's a huge telescope, as big as a lot of them that are on the Earth, but it's in space. And so it doesn't have to cope with air or anything with regard to its ability to look out and gather light coming in. There's no air to distort the image at all. Amazing images come from the Hubble. Well, they found a patch of sky. Now, the Hubble is such a powerful telescope that if you were to take a really big beach ball, a really big one, and take a sewing needle, a really small one, and put a dot on that beach ball, that's the area of the sky that the Hubble takes in when it looks out in any direction. They found a patch of sky about 20 years ago, and they said, we want to do an experiment. We want to see what we're not seeing. They found a patch of sky where there was nothing. The Hubble didn't see anything. Nothing there. This tiny little narrow spot. Well, what they did was they said, we're going to do an experiment. We're going to take the Hubble and we're going to focus it on that spot for a week and not move it. That allows a whole week for whatever's there, the light to come in. It's like when you take a camera and you make a really long exposure in the dark. That's what they're doing. It's called the Hubble Deep Field Image. You can go to a store and buy one for $1. Well, when the image came back, the scientists who were doing this were just astonished. On the image, just this little photograph, there are 2,500 galaxies. Not stars, galaxies. Every galaxy with billions of stars and planets within it. 2,500 on just this pinprick out of the sky. It allowed the scientists to suddenly realize this universe is not at all empty. It is full of things like that. Now, when the scientists look at you and me and they say, how could you believe in God? Because think of what the earth means in terms of that. The pinprick in the sky, 2,500 galaxies that we can see, and you multiply that times the whole universe, what is the earth to that? Nothing. Nothing. You couldn't even call us a grain of sand in that. And people say, how can you believe there's a God? Look how insignificant we are. I agree, we are. But maybe there's another way to look at it. Maybe the universe just has to be that big and that old and constituted that way for us to be. That could be too. That God had to do it that way just for us to be. Now, when I look at what's going on with Paul or anybody's life, maybe things have to be in our lives like they are just for our lives to be like they are. And while God is working, God is doing things, maybe things have to be just this complicated and just this busy and just these many things going on around us in order for God's plan to work out the way it's supposed to work out. The universe is what it is now. It's fallen. It's not the way God intended it. And maybe all of our lives have some part, I know they do, some part to be played in God's plan. Now, there are lots of ways to look at that. One of them is to say, well, did that mean that God wanted me to do what I did that got me put in the big house for 6 months back there when I was a teenager? Or did God want me to drink? Or did God want me to use drugs? Or did God want me to do whatever bad things I've done or you've done in our past? And say, was that part of God's plan? No. But God's plan contains it. In other words, if I decide that I don't like Al, and so when Al steps out the door, I go out there and I don't know if I'm capable of it. Al's pretty big, but I take Al and take him down and break his neck just because I'm mad at Al. I know God doesn't want me to do that, but God will adjust His plan to encompass that bad thing. Does that make sense? These things that are happening to them on this boat are not good things. When they were in Fair Haven at the dock, Paul said, let's don't go out there. If we go out there, it's going to be bad. God has told me that we're going to be shipwrecked if we go out there. They went out there anyway. So now they're out there. That wasn't God's will necessarily that they sail off into the middle of the Mediterranean after the time of the year in which nobody should be sailing, but they went anyway. So God's plan still has to work. He's going to make the adjustments. And that goes for everybody in this room. No matter what we're doing, no matter where we are, 276 people adrift at sea doesn't look like a good plan. But there they are. God is still working. They are at the mercy of their circumstances. Totally at the mercy of the circumstances. All of us in this room are at the mercy of our circumstances to one degree or another. You know, scientists and philosophers, people with very large brains, write fat books. What is time? They don't even know what time is. Some people say time is physical. Some people say it's not. I don't think it is, but that doesn't even matter what I think because nobody knows. What is time? Yet every person in this room, we are trapped in the river of time, and it is moving one way, always, no matter what. Think about what that means. You and I cannot, we have people, they say things like this. We've said it, I've said it. I'm going to save some time. We're not saving any time. Time is going. It doesn't matter what you do with it, it goes. I could sit on my rear end the whole day and waste the time or spend the time. But I promise you one thing, the time will go by. No matter what. We're trapped in this utterly unstoppable stream. All you got to do is look in the mirror and you know that you're trapped in a stream you can't stop, I can't stop. We are powerless to escape it. And there's a lot going on in that time around us through our lives. A lot. What are we going to do? What's Paul going to do? What's anybody going to do? We need a champion. We need somebody who can say something about time, who can say something about what's going on in your life and in my life and the lives of the people around us and the people we care about. You notice something about these guys on this ship. I don't know if you ever thought about it this way. This is an important feature of this that it is for me. Their lives are connected. Now think about it. 276. It says a couple of sailors. It doesn't say, what does it say, 3 or 4? Let's just say 4 sailors are going to go out, cut the ropes, and get in the dinghy and sneak off. And Paul says they saw them and they said, if these guys do this, none of us can be saved. Think about why. What's the matter with if those guys go? Maybe we'll all be saved and they won't. We are connected. That is such a picture of the church. If somebody in this room or anybody who's connected with our church decides, you know what? This is something I really want to do. And it's something that, let's just call it sin. It's wrong. Something we want to do. I just like to do that. That person may do it. And none of us may know about it. God knows about it. And we are connected to it whether we like it or not. It changes the constitution of this congregation. Now, there are lots of things like that. For instance, we see how many people are here today. There are lots of people we all know who have chosen not to be here. That affects this congregation today. It affects the fact that you are here affects this congregation today. We are connected, and what we're doing with our lives, multiply that times the whole world of people who believe. God's plan is working out, but we are all swept up in it in some way. There is no life, no minute, nothing weird. Kind of like that song that Winston played this morning. What we do really does matter. How we live, the choices we make. But God's plan is going to carry on no matter what we decide. We can say to ourselves, I'd like to be part of it, or I'd like to not. And God will say to you and to me, well, however you want it to be, go ahead. But I'm going to continue doing what I had planned to do, whether you want to be part of that or not, whether I want to be part of it. When one of us disobeys, it affects us all. When we're obedient, it affects us all. When we make decisions in this world, it affects us all. Just like these people on this ship. few of them were going to get off the boat. It affected everybody. They couldn't, any of them, be saved unless they all stayed together. I don't know what the message for you is, but for me it says our lives are very connected, very connected. I remember in Luke 17, you had this group of lepers. This is fascinating to me. You can read it at your leisure. These 10 lepers come to Jesus. Now, in the time in which Jesus walked the earth, if you were a leper, you had they called leprosy was a bunch of different diseases, not just one. It was just something wrong with your skin. You had to walk through town ringing a bell or shouting or something to let everybody around you know that you were leprous. And the way you did it was, in Palestine, in Judea, you said unclean. Top of your lungs, ringing a bell, unclean. A rabbi wasn't allowed to even come downwind from somebody who was sick this way. These 10 come to Jesus, and Jesus heals them. And 9 of them leave. 1 of them comes back to thank Jesus. What did it mean for that leper, or any of those lepers, 20 years later? Think for a minute. The one leper who came back and thanked Jesus, do you think that 20 years later he thought about the leprosy, or he thought about what had happened because he had the leprosy? The leprosy got him to Jesus. Paul's in the middle of the ocean. These guys who are all with him, God is using these events to bring Paul where he wants Paul to be. And the people that Paul is going to contact, as we go on in this text, you will see that this is not just a random occurrence in Paul's life. How do we see the things? I remember reading Solzhenitsyn, spent decades in the Siberian Gulag, came out and wrote, "Thank you, God, for the Gulag. Without the Gulag, I would have never known you." We just don't know what God is doing, and things can look very, very grim for us many, many times. I said it last week. I don't want to be a Job. I don't want God to say to me, "Rip, you know what? I want you to really go through a lot of really bad stuff so that other people will be blessed." That doesn't sound good to me. I'm just like anybody. I like comfort. I like to sleep, eat, and all those things that we all enjoy doing. But we're just like little children in that way. A small child. Why do we raise children? We raise them in order to form them, teach them, grow them, make them better people. We're trying to build them into somebody. They don't like any of that. When we tell them they can't do something they want to do, they hate that. When we tell them they got to do something they don't want to do, they hate that. And they grow up for 18 years fighting against us. We're just like that with God. We are just like that. God allows things into our lives. He never has harm in mind for us, ever. But His good in this world is what He's trying to work out. And you and I have choices to make about the way in which we're going to respond to whatever God brings into our lives. And those choices matter a lot. It's very immediate for me right now. Becky and I are going through something, and it's not... Becky's great. She just says, I'm just going to trust God about this. And I'm thinking, I don't want to do that. I want to know what's going to happen. I want it to be worked out. I don't want to worry about that. What about these lepers? Did they think 20 years later, thank you, God, for leprosy? Because leprosy brought me to Jesus. People are told in our culture, in the church culture in which we are, don't ask why. That is a lie. If you think that, if you think that you shouldn't ask God why, you've believed a lie. It's a lie. Think about it. You know why people say that? They say it because for them, asking God why is a lack of faith. That's crazy. That's crazy. You know what it is? It's a lack of faith not to ask, and I'll tell you why. Because when we don't ask, when we feel like, I can't ask God why this is happening, it's because we really don't believe He's going to answer us. But if I'm asking Him why, I'm doing it because I believe He will. He has the answer. He has the answer. It is a lack of faith to not ask why. David did it all the time. He's a pretty good example. A man after God's heart. I don't know where everybody is.